Hello everyone, welcome to this revision video for GCSE History on the topic of women in Nazi Germany. What we're going to do is we're going to focus on how successful the Nazi policies towards women were between 1933 and 1939 in terms of them achieving their aims. So without further ado, let's find out some more information about this. Let's go! Okay then, so this is a topic which it often comes up, and it's a really interesting topic to think about how successful the Nazi policies were towards women. So there's a timeline of some key events. It can be quite difficult sometimes to put a timeline on some of these different events, but these are some of the things that happened. So when the Nazis came to power in January 1933, when Hitler became Chancellor, he set about achieving the different aims and objectives in different spheres of people's lives, and he wanted to gain control of all aspects of people's lives in this totalitarian society that he was trying to create. So in 1933, he passed a law for the encouragement of marriage. Remember, one of the things that the Nazis were very interested in was to restore Germany to its kind of traditional values. Hitler talked about the sort of traditional peasant family as being the sort of perfect family that he wanted to create. He saw some of the cultural changes that took place in Germany in the 1920s as abhorrent towards him. He thought it was immoral, so he wanted to change the sort of role of women in the society he was trying to create, and obviously this very much ties in with the Nazi racial policy that they had, their policies towards young people as well. So you can't completely look at this topic in isolation from those other aspects. One of the key things you can see her pictured was Gertrude Schultz-Klink, was appointed to oversee policies towards women. We'll talk more about her later. We'll find out about the Lebensborn Spring of Life program that was created in 1935 by Heinrich Himmler. It's also worth noting that the Nuremberg laws had an impact on marriage in Nazi Germany. From 1936, the economy refocused on rearmament and preparing for war, and the idea of self-sufficiency, and this had an impact on more women returning to work. There actually, by 1939, was a labour shortage in Germany, so this affected the success of Nazi policies. You can see that in 1937 when the marriage loan scheme, which we'll learn about, was amended to include women. Divorce laws were amended in 1938, and a nice little stat there, at the outbreak of World War II, 35% of married women had a job. So let's just find out a little bit more, firstly, about how life changed for women in Germany between the 1920s and the 1930s. So just thinking back to the Weimar Republic, we know that the Weimar Constitution created in 1919 was a very liberal, quite a democratic constitution. And this had meant that during the Weimar Republic, women had had many rights. They'd had the right to vote, they had equal pay to men if they were working in the government. Many women attended university, went on to have professional jobs, much more freedoms for women in terms of socialising, dressing how they wanted to. So we know that the Weimar Republic was a very liberal society, and cities like Berlin were very sort of free, and there was a great expression in terms of the culture. So we also know, as hinted at before, that sort of there were elements within German society, conservative elements within German society, not just within the Nazi Party, but within certain conservative groups, certain religious groups as well, that didn't particularly like what happened to what they perceived as the role and status of women during this time, towards things like family values, and wanted to return to this. And Hitler kind of tapped into this more kind of traditional conservative view of the nature of family and the role of women in society. So let's just have a little look at what Hitler wanted to achieve and what his policies towards women actually were. So one of the things that Hitler wanted to do was increase the birth rate. He thought that if Germany had a higher population, that would make Germany more powerful, able to conduct wars abroad, able to seek living space, the Lebensraum in the east. So he wanted to increase the number of marriages, he wanted to decrease the number of women in work, and this obviously was a twofold approach. Obviously it would help him achieve his policies toward women, but also it helped his strategy to reduce unemployment in Germany as well, by removing women from their jobs and creating jobs for men. He wanted women to be removed from politics, He wanted women to stay at home and adopt a healthy lifestyle. You can see here this Nazi propaganda picture from the 1930s. Sums up what Hitler viewed as the ideal traditional German family, sort of peasant origin, Aryan, for example. You can see here a family, lots of children, and the boy sort of playing in the sand. You can see there the little girl is playing with a doll. So all very deliberate imagery there to encourage this. And I think encouragement is very important in terms of the understanding the Nazi approach towards women, because a lot of the changes they wanted to bring in were being brought in through propaganda, through what they did with the youth groups, for example, through the education that girls achieved at school, rather than making many of these things particularly compulsory. Women shouldn't follow fashions, they should have a natural look, so things like makeup, for example, was not encouraged. That was seen as, you know, an Americanization, which was to be discouraged in Nazi Germany. Now, learn this phrase, Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church, was a phrase that was used a lot to sum up the Nazi policy towards women. So let's have a look at this in more detail on what the Nazis actually tried to achieve. So these are some of the policies that the Nazis brought in towards women. So women were banned from professional careers from 1933. Women encouraged to stay at home, not take the jobs of men. Mother's Day, or Muttertag, as it's known as in German, it's quite nice to learn those German phrases, declared an official holiday in 1933. And it's worth noting that Hitler talked about the absolute central importance of women within Nazi society in terms of the role that they were having, but he very much had this idea that men and women should have very different roles. They passed a law for the encouragement of marriage, which gave marriage loans to married couples if the woman agreed to stop working, and then the amount that had to be repaid would be reduced for each child they had. So they're obviously encouraging large families here. From 1936, women got monthly payments to help with raising children. Divorce laws were changed so that if a wife couldn't have children, or if she had an abortion, it could be used as a ground for divorce. And the Mother's Cross was like a reward system given to women for the number of children they had. And it was awarded each year on the 12th of August, which was Hitler's mother's birthday. You can see there some of these policies that they were having here towards women, to encourage women to stay at home, encourage them to get married, and encouraging them to have lots of children. Other things that are important for you to know about are the German women's enterprise. Now, this was the Deutsche Frauenwerk, which is the DFW. So remember that, DFW, the German women's enterprise. And this lady, Gertrude Scholz-Klink, was appointed in 1934. And you can see a little quote there from a speech that she made in 1936. Now, in the end, this had 6 million members and was really, really important for, I suppose, the propaganda, perhaps the indoctrination of women during this time. You can see there by 1939, again, another nice statistic to remember, 1.7 million women had attended Nazi courses on subjects like childcare, cooking and sewing by that time. So that's a really good example of how the Nazis were trying to achieve their policies towards women for you to remember. The Nazis also wanted to encourage as many births as possible. So an interesting one to learn about is the Spring of Life, or Fountain of Life program, called the Lebensborn, which was brought in by SS leader Heinrich Himmler in 1935. Now, initially, the idea was to provide nurseries, financial support, etc., help with childcare for women who had children with SS men. But later, the program developed so that single women could go along to this program, sign up to this program, breed with SS men, to create pure children for German families. And between 38 and 41, one Lebensborn home helped achieve 540 mothers give birth. So again, some good statistics there for you just to see some of the things the Nazis did to encourage a higher birth rate during this time. And obviously this very much ties in with the Nazi racial policies as well, in terms of creating this Aryan society that Hitler talked about in the 1930s. The Nazis wanted women to stay at home, not work, so you can see there, banned from professional jobs. Nice stat there, 1934, 306,000 women had given up work. Women couldn't be judges or do jury service. Education for girls changed a lot as well. Big drop in the number of female students in higher education there as well. So these are all really good statistics for you to think about the impact of Nazi policies towards women during this time. You can see here as well, youth groups, so the League of German Maidens, for example, focused on the same activities as boys, like the character building, the political kind of indoctrination, but specific tasks that the League of German Maidens did were things like train girls to be future mothers, so to cook, iron, make beds, sew, prepare to be wives and mothers. Racial hygiene, for example, so women were taught to keep the race pure by only marrying Aryan men. So again, this real emphasis that the policies towards women are very much about this indoctrination of young girls and women about what their role in society should be. There were obviously very contradictory policies in this, and it's very interesting to note that of the women that were, say, married to leading Nazis, for example, very few of those women actually paid any attention to Nazi policy towards women. Probably the only one that actually did was the wife of Martin Bormann, Frau Bormann, who did actually have a child and 10 children, which was sort of seen as, you know, you want to try and have as many children as possible. You can see her pictured. Hermann Goering and his wife Emmy, for example, frequently had lavish parties, you know, flaunted the latest fashions from France, from Paris, wore makeup, for example, didn't follow those Nazi policies whatsoever. What a surprise. Some nice stats here. You can see the stats of marriages, divorces and births during this time. So you can see some slight increases here. Not completely dramatic, but we can see some increases in that. Whether that was to do with the improvements in the economy or whether it's to do with Nazi policies is obviously one very much open for debate. And again, you can see here that one of the things that very much didn't really change was women's employment. And this is partly to do with the needs of the economy, meant that women had to be working really during this time. So initial success of women coming out of work, but as the 1930s progressed, more and more women going back to work. 35% of married women had jobs in 1939. So some evidence of success, you can have a look at these different things. We talked about this. Yes, the birth rate did increase, employment for men went up. Many women did follow Nazi policies at first. I think the fact that the German Women's Enterprise, the DFW, under Gertrude Scholz-Klink, did have so many members is evidence of some success. We know that the Nazis were quite cautious in this approach towards women, and they did tie in with many ideas that did exist within German society and conservative groups. So there is evidence for success, but there's also evidence for failure. So it might be that the birth rate increased due to economic recovery. It might be that there were other factors at play here. But I think one of the big things you can see here is that the Nazis were not at all successful in achieving their policies towards women not working. And even by 1939, the average number of children in German families didn't fluctuate massively during this time, which probably suggests, I think, that the Nazi policies towards women had only a marginal impact, really, only a marginal impact. But I think what is fair to say is that certainly within the sort of rights and opportunities that women had during this time in terms of professional careers, going on to things like higher education and university, you know, those rights were severely restricted by the Nazis. That's absolutely for sure. So a little source focus there, you can pause that, you can just have a little look at that. It gives you a good kind of insight into life for women during Nazi Germany. So here are just some key facts ultimately for you to remember. So you just go through these and just make sure that you can remember what these things were about and some of the key things. And the best way to revise this is really to think about that whole idea of, firstly, success and failure. You know, how successful the Nazis in achieving their aims. So obviously you need to be able to define what the Nazi aims were. And the second thing for you to be really able to articulate is, well, how did the lives of women change? In what ways were the lives of women changed between 1933 and 1939? So you're looking at some of those key areas around things like family life, opportunities, how work changed, for example, how the Nazis tried to encourage a higher birth rate. So thanks very much for listening. We've found out there about how successful Nazi policies were towards women. Thanks for listening, and bye-bye.